Gene, this is great. We have so much to talk about.
We
but
do.
I
Fun
know
subjects.
we have just a bit of time, so let's jump in. Tell us about the Case Foundation. For those who may not be familiar with all the work that you do, tell us about what drives the work that you do. What's the heartbeat?
Sure.
Of the
Well, good morning,
organization?
everyone. So I started my career in technology, helping to build the internet revolution. And when I retired from that, my husband and I started the Case Foundation. And our mission is that we invest in people and ideas that can change the world.
That's wonderful. Now, you've most recently decided to be a lot more intentional about a very specific branch of entrepreneurship, and that's inclusive entrepreneurship.
That's right.
What is inspired? Yeah, woo.
I love
yeah.
that. We're just getting started. All right.
Now, what inspired you to look at that particular, point of view?
Sure. Well, the reason I started with my early career, which was building the internet revolution, I think through that experience, we both saw the incredible power of the entrepreneurial spirit to change the world. We believe that's as true today as it's ever been. But when you actually peel back the onion and look at what's happening here in the United States and in places around the world, there's a lot of hope and promise, but we have a lot of work to do. I'll give you an example. So venture capital has been closely looked at in the United States for its unbelievable, powerful role in giving jet fuel to high-growth startups. But if you think about it today, when we think about the iconic entrepreneurs and the iconic companies, too often we think about white males. Well, why is that? Venture capital in recent years, 90% of it has gone to men. Only 10% has gone to women. Only 1% has gone to African Americans. And 75% of all venture capital went to 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts, leaving the other 47 states to fight over a quarter of the pie. So what's happened in recent years is the very jet fuel that can create big new companies, exciting, iconic brands, et cetera, is going through a very narrow channel of the same kind of people. And we just think there's an incredible opportunity to seize to broaden the tent and level the playing field and give more people a shot at building the next great American company.
So part of leveling the playing field is a new campaign you guys have initiated, hashtag Faces of Founders.
Yes.
So tell us more about that. It must have been exciting to launch that at South by South Lawn at the White House.
So we launched it a few weeks ago on the South Lawn of the White House. There was a partnership with South by Southwest and the White House. Of course, we love PopTech here, but that was that partnership. And really what we did there was we launched a campaign that includes a site, and I want to invite all of you to be part of it. It's hashtag Faces of Founders on social media, but it's facesoffounders.org. And we invite everyone who is either a champion of entrepreneurs or an entrepreneur herself or himself to come in and lend your photo. And if you're an entrepreneur, and particularly one from an inclusive segment, we want to hear your stories. And we have a great partnership with Fast Company magazine, who will take the 5 winning stories and profile them in Fast Company. And we think one of the sort of unintentional things that happens is we just don't talk enough about the inclusive entrepreneurs that are out there doing unbelievable things. Tory Burch, Oprah Winfrey, Damon John, I could go right down the list of women and people of color who've been building great companies for a long time, but as segments have been underinvested. So we've launched Faces of Founders with the hope that we can change the narrative, change the dialogue, and the very definition we think about when we think about great entrepreneurs. And we'd love the help of our PopTech crowd here.
Well, you've been doing this work for more than 2 decades. I mean, obviously you've been able to see some of the trends,
We have.
and especially within businesses geared towards run by women and run by people of color.
Yeah.
What are some of the trends you're seeing? What are some of the opportunities?
Yeah, so we see some different things. I mean, I talked a little bit about, the data inside of the US, but like Eric, who introduced us, he has something called the iHub in Kenya. And when we visited there last summer, the first night, all we did was have a display of the women entrepreneurs and the great businesses that they're building in Africa. Then the next day, we did a pitch competition, and I was struck by how many of the Africans that were pitching were women. In fact, everywhere we went around Africa, when we would bring a room of entrepreneurs together, when we would host pitch competitions and make investments, we were struck by the disproportionate number of women at the table building great businesses. And, a little bit like Africa, where we see so many great innovative solutions coming to communities of great need, Here in the US, the same is true. So we have some entrepreneurs, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of them, Steph Spears, was raised by a single mom on welfare. And she watched her mom struggle in paying things as basic as the electric bill. And so when the solar revolution came along, Steph got pretty excited. But then she realized that tens of millions of households in the US will be locked out of the solar revolution for simple reasons. They're renters, they're low-income families, or maybe their house just isn't positioned the right way. So what did she do? She solved the problem. She's building community solar farms that neighbors can share at a low cost. And I think of it as, the sharing economy for where it's needed most. So what we're finding is that when we broaden the tent and we bring more entrepreneurs in with different backgrounds and different problems that they have lived, they will build new solutions really to address segments of society that have been a little bit underserved in our innovation economy. We saw this in Africa. I've seen this in the West Bank. I've seen this all over the world. And we're seeing it here in the United States, too. And it's part of the reason I think we're so committed to making sure that many of these entrepreneurs are getting championed and invested in.
Speaking of investment, where do you see the intersection between impact investing and inclusive entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, the story I just told about Steph, we would call that an impact company, but the impact investing movement is taking shape at the same time, and so in some ways it's like a beautiful, perfect storm. Impact companies are really companies that will provide not just a financial return, but a social return as well. And many of these companies are looking at our daunting challenges in communities both here and in places around the world, and building great companies to solve them. When I went from the private sector and created the Case Foundation, I spent most of my time in the early days in what we call the social sector, which is philanthropy, nonprofit, and government, the ones we really have relied on to address our social challenges. But what I often didn't see was entrepreneurs at the table. And we still believe there is a terrific opportunity to infuse, and a lot of the folks working in nonprofit and philanthropy bring an entrepreneurial spirit, but it's an exciting opportunity to bring companies to the table. And when I think of it, it's kind of let's put all the oars in the water. We've had government, we've had nonprofit, we've had philanthropy carrying this burden on their own with fabulous, committed people. But imagine the power now if business comes along, if entrepreneurs come along, and think about some of those challenges and build innovative solutions to address them.
So what would you say to the people in the room here? How can all of us help with changing this narrative around inclusive entrepreneurship?
Right.
What can we do?
Well, you can start by joining Faces of Founders. If you have a story, tell it. If you know someone who has a compelling story, please encourage them to tell us their story as well. But in your own networks, think about it. Are there folks that you know doing things around entrepreneurs, maybe some investors you know? Could you encourage them to broaden their scope? There's been some research done that says, we might have to change it up a little bit. Turns out that 93% of the investment managers at the top 100 venture firms are men. We're probably going to have to change some of the decision-making teams if we're going to see more segments of society receive the kind of investments that mostly men and mostly white men have been receiving. Again, in many ways unintentional, and I want to touch on one thing, and that is, when we started looking at this, we're like, well, how could this be? Like, why is this? No one intends to leave people out. And what we really came to discover, we asked a few questions. We said, well, is it that women and people of color aren't starting enterprises? Well, of course, we knew they were, but it turns out that women are the largest growing segment of entrepreneurs. People of color, similarly. There's African-American started firms grew at a 60% rate in recent years versus 9% growth rate of non-minority firms. Hispanic entrepreneurs have tripled. There's more than 2 million in the United States. So this is not an issue of them not being out there. We looked at some other things like performance data. And there again, these segments don't just perform, there's growing data that they outperform. And those middle states that haven't been getting the investment, the majority of the Fortune 500 companies were started there. So, came to realize a lot is being written about it these days. One of the things behind it is something called unconscious bias. Hey, people in our networks are people that we're familiar with, that we're comfortable with, that are similar to us. The people we relate most to are people that are similar to us. So it would only make sense that when investment decisions are made, someone has a clearly distinct advantage if they're similar to us. We can relate to them, we feel a little more comfortable. So basically, I think a big part of solving this really comes down to recognizing that unconscious bias is real and beginning to build systems around it to just be intentional in building programs and support for the inclusive entrepreneurs.
Can those conversations, though, sometimes be a little uncomfortable?
No question we have to get out of our comfort zone on this one, but I think the opportunity is so compelling that actually when we talk to people about the data and talk to investment firms about the data, et cetera, there really is a moment where they go, I guess I just didn't realize this. So a big part of it is recognizing it, and I think the second part of it is committing to change it.
Well, the Faces of Founders program, that campaign, you've gotten about more than thousands of entries.
We do.
Like in the past couple of weeks. Have there been any surprises or things that you discovered?
You know,
I think,
it's a topic that when we go out and talk to folks, it is amazing how I think, and I want to say maybe particularly in the United States, because when we think about it, the American dream itself is built on the idea that anyone, anywhere can take forward the next big idea. And so when we talk in this space, we're really just talking about returning to what we've believed about who we are for a long time, and now we just need to course correct to get back to that.
If any founder has any kind of apprehension about how they will be, perceived or received, what kind of tips would you give them to, how do they prepare for making a big pitch, for getting, the attention of a great venture capitalist and making those right connections?
Right. Well, of course, there are these things that I mentioned. Eric actually has one in Nairobi called the iHub. But there are things that are hubs and communities that support entrepreneurs. And they're called accelerators or incubators. And most communities have them, or if you're near a community of any size. And there they really do the coaching and the mentoring and try to provide strategic guidance. Sometimes there can be some investment that comes along with it. If you know an entrepreneur, you are one, and you feel like, man, I could really use a leg up, attach yourself to one of these. Start by going to the events. Then think about whether you should actually be housed there. Many of them actually create office space. But I think making sure you have a community of support, because if you're a woman or a person of color trying to take a company forward, you have unique obstacles. The data is very clear on this. So what can help you overcome those obstacles that will be there is a community of support around you to train you, encourage you, and basically help you stay in the game and be fearless.
Before we go into the Q&A, any last message that you'd like to send to this audience, that you'd like people to leave away with?
Well, I think it's a time of democratizing a lot of things, and I think we see the power and the potential in democratization. Vanessa and Eric mentioned rather that I'm chairman of National Geographic, and even in that space, we're finding new innovation because we're democratizing science and exploration. Some of the most exciting things we're doing are putting tools into the hands of people everywhere to come along and be part of science and exploration in our work at National Geographic. So I think as we look out across society, instead of thinking about these things as problems, if we can look at them as opportunities to seize, I think it gets a lot more people excited about trying to make a change.
Great. Well, now it's our opportunity to ask the audience to ask any questions they may have. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A, and I see some hands.
Hi, my name is Katie Shorey. We are actually launching an accelerator program in Portland called Venture Hall.
All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi, thank you. We're launching an accelerator in Portland, Maine called Venture Hall, and it's going to have a year-round programming element to it as well. And I'm wondering, Jean, what are you seeing in terms of helping engage and move forward the immigrant communities? Because here in Maine,
I'm sorry, can you repeat the what community?
The immigrant communities.
Oh, yes.
Because we have a very large immigrant community here in Maine, and just wanting your input on that.
Yeah, well, boy, immigrants are rocking it on the entrepreneurial front. And in fact, 40% of the Fortune 500 was started by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. So, they have added so much to our economy, and we would be wise to keep those trends going. So I want to encourage you there. There are, in the same way that I talked about sort of special outreach in terms of both recruiting and selection, even think about things like if you're doing a pitch competition and you're bringing your entrepreneurs in, put an immigrant on your judging panel. because it will encourage the entrepreneur when they're pitching if someone looks a little like them, and it'll, the chances are it will help balance out how the different pitchers are viewed.
That's great. Another question?
I'm impressed that you can see Vanessa, because here we go,
I'm
down in
like
front here.
Squinting, but
Hi, I run a small company, and I'm often wondering, am I an entrepreneur? Because I'm not going for 10x returns or 100x returns. So how
Yeah.
do you define it?
That's a great question. There's all kinds of businesses in America, right? 99% of them are small businesses. And some of those small businesses don't aspire to get larger, but many of them do. They're dreaming the same dreams as, the people on the coast, some of the elites, et cetera. And I think that, you're an entrepreneur no matter what business you start. If you aspire to be a high-growth entrepreneur, that means that you are dreaming big dreams about taking your company to a whole new level, of speeding up and accelerating its growth. And this is where we've seen venture capital have a powerful role. Now, venture isn't the only way you can build the company, of course, but part of what we see is that it really does provide jet fuel. So I would say you are an entrepreneur if you've started a company, and good for you. That's what's made this economy so strong. But if you're a high-growth entrepreneur, you're dreaming big dreams about taking it to new levels.
another question. Can I ask just a quick question?
Sure. I think there's one over there.
Up?
I don't know where that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I see a couple back there. You mentioned access to capital, and particularly in absolutely of color, you don't always have that family friend or that relative that can help you get that 20 to 50,000 that you need to get going.
Right.
What are some other ways that you can access capital at that seemingly very low level?
Yeah, well, here again, I really want to encourage engagement with incubators or accelerators, because they often have angel funders around them who are actually looking for great opportunities to invest in. And I should say, if you're unfamiliar with where they might be in your community, if you have a university near you, it might be a good idea to call a university and say, hey, I'm looking for this, can you refer me to something? Because most universities are attached actually to these sort of movements of incubators and accelerators.
Good morning. My name is Marina Robinson Snowden. I'm a 6-year PhD student in nuclear engineering from MIT. And my question is kind of around this idea of culture, class, and resistance, right? Because to the point that Vanessa made, this is sometimes a very uncomfortable conversation around representation and diversity in certain spaces. And I was wondering, since you're a specialist in this, what are some strategies that you have about moving these traditional institutions, whether they're academia or financial institutions, towards embracing this data that says that this is an area that we need to focus on?
Yeah, so, in our work at the Case Foundation, yeah, all right, they're there. First of all, I'm not a specialist. I'm really just a champion, a passionate champion, because I see the potential here. But in our work at the Case Foundation, we say we try to inspire, educate, and activate. And I think we can inspire people by pointing out the tremendous opportunity this represents for a stronger economy, for more jobs, for basically a fairer system that most people believe in here in this country. We need to educate them with the data. The data hasn't actually been very promoted out there, and that's part of the reason we launched our Faces of Founders. And then we need to activate them. And we do work with organizations to talk very specifically about how they can be more intentional. And I think it's going to take all three of those things before this needle really starts to move.
I thought I saw another question back there. Yes? No, I think we are almost out of time. One last question.
All right, great.
Do you have ideas about bringing things like PopTech and the things that you're investing into the ordinary people? Because of my work, I'm in touch with a lot of ordinary people, and I'm still shocked at how often people don't know about TED or PopTech or all the wonderful places for inspiration and information these days. The ordinary people need to know about this.
Yeah, well, of course, with many of these conferences, I would have this bias given my background, but with many of these conferences, the ability to stream plays a huge role. Literally tens of millions of people have had access to the content. If they can't make it into the audience, they can at least get the benefit of the information. But we spend a lot of time out in what I call non-obvious areas, doing gatherings. My husband, for instance, has a a national tour he does called Rise of the Rest. He's gone to 25 cities around the United States with a bus. And basically he goes there and he gets entrepreneurs and champions and people from the community and leaders from the community. And he talks about the importance of investing in our entrepreneurs and some of the best ideas that we're seeing out there around innovation. So I think we do need to take them into all kinds of pockets. I spend time in universities, I spend time out across America. I try to go around the world and do different work, et cetera. But I agree with you. I think there still really is almost, and it's unintentional in many ways. There's just still sort of almost elite access to some of the best ideas out there. And of course, the work of the Case Foundation has been to try to change that for a really long time.
Jean, we're so sorry to say we're out of time, but
All right.
this has been wonderful. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Vanessa, and thanks all of you.